In the heart of North Yorkshire, hidden behind miles of rolling hills, ancient woodlands, and narrow country lanes that wind through some of England's most beautiful countryside, there stands a palace so vast, so impossibly grand, so overwhelming in its scale and ambition, that when it was first built over 3 centuries ago, people thought the owner had gone completely mad. 325 years later, that same family still lives there. This is not a museum piece that has been handed over to the state. This is not a property managed by the National Trust or English Heritage. This is not a hotel or a conference center or an empty shell maintained by a charitable foundation. This is a private home occupied and controlled by the same bloodline that commissioned its construction in 1699. While nearly every other great English aristocratic family sold their estates, surrendered them to the government, watched them burn down or crumble into picturesque ruins, or simply walked away when the bills became too high, the Howards did something different. They held on. They fought. They adapted. They made sacrifices that would have been unthinkable to their ancestors. They survived. But the cost of that survival, the near disasters they narrowly avoided, the compromises they were forced to make, and the sheer stubborn determination it took to keep this place in family hands for over 3 centuries, that is a story most people have never heard. And it is a story that reveals something profound about power, legacy, and what it truly takes to preserve something across the centuries. Castle Howard is not actually a castle. That is the first thing you need to understand. It has no defensive walls, no moat filled with water, no battlements for archers, no murder holes or portcullises, or any of the military features that define a real medieval castle. It was never designed to withstand a siege or protect its occupants from attack. It was built for one purpose and one purpose only: to announce to the entire world that the Howard family had arrived at the very pinnacle of English power, wealth, and influence. And they wanted everyone, from the King of England sitting in his palace in London to the poorest tenant farmer working in the fields, to know it. The house itself covers over 9 acres under a single roof. Just stop and think about that for a moment. 9 acres. That is larger than 6 football pitches. It sits in the middle of a 1,000-acre estate, surrounded by meticulously landscaped gardens, ornamental lakes, carefully positioned temples and monuments, towering obelisks, and architectural follies scattered across the grounds like pieces on a grand chessboard. When you stand at the main entrance and look out across the facade of the building, it stretches so far to the left and right that you genuinely cannot see both ends at the same time. The central dome, inspired directly by Christopher Wren's dome at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, rises 120 feet into the Yorkshire sky. On a clear morning, if you are standing on the right hill 15 miles away, you can see that dome glinting in the sunlight, dominating the landscape. This was not architecture in any conventional sense. This was theater. This was propaganda built in stone and marble. This was a declaration of dominance, a statement that the Howards were not just powerful, they were untouchable. But here is what makes this story fundamentally different from every other tale of aristocratic excess, extravagance, and eventual decline that has been told 1,000 times before. The family that built this palace was not new money trying to buy respectability. They were not merchants who had struck it rich in overseas trade. They were not industrialists who had made fortunes in coal mines or textile factories. The Howards were already one of the most powerful, most dangerous, most politically connected families in all of England. They had been for centuries. They had served kings and queens. They had commanded armies in major wars. They had negotiated international treaties. They had married into royalty across Europe. They had also been imprisoned, exiled, and executed for treason. And yet somehow, impossibly, they had clawed their way back to power every single time. By the time they decided to build Castle Howard, they had already survived wars, revolutions, religious persecutions, and political upheavals that had completely destroyed dozens of other noble families. And that history, that centuries-long pattern of survival through ruthless pragmatism, strategic marriages, careful political positioning, and an almost supernatural ability to know when to fight and when to retreat, is what allowed them to hold on to Castle Howard when every rational calculation, every financial advisor, Every practical consideration said they should let it go. The Howard name first appears in English historical records in the 13th century, but the family does not become truly significant, does not start to really matter in the grand scheme of English politics, until the absolute chaos of the 15th century during the Wars of the Roses. This was one of the most brutal, destructive periods in English history. Two rival branches of the royal family, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, tore the country apart in a civil war that lasted over 30 years. Thousands of people died on battlefields across England. Entire noble families were completely wiped out. Estates were confiscated by whichever side happened to be winning at that particular moment. Titles were stripped away. Heirs were disinherited or murdered. Survival during this period required not just military skill and battlefield courage, but extraordinary political cunning. You had to know when to fight and when to negotiate. You had to know when to stay loyal and when to switch sides. You had to be able to read the political winds, predict which way power was shifting, and position yourself accordingly. The Howards became absolute masters at this deadly game. In 1483, John Howard fought for King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, one of the most important and decisive battles in all of English history. This was the battle that ended the Wars of the Roses and brought the Tudor dynasty to power under Henry VII. John Howard died on that battlefield, cut down while fighting for the losing side. By all rights, by all the normal rules of medieval politics, that should have been the absolute end of the Howard family. When your patron king loses the battle and dies, and you die fighting for him, your family is usually destroyed. Your estates are seized by the victorious side. Your titles are revoked and given to someone else. Your children are left with nothing, their futures destroyed. But John Howard's son, Thomas Howard, did something absolutely brilliant. He survived the battle, probably by surrendering at the right moment. He immediately declared his complete and total loyalty to the new king, Henry VII. And then he proved himself so useful, so competent, so absolutely indispensable to the new regime, that within just a few years he had not only recovered all of his father's confiscated lands and titles, but had been elevated to even greater positions of power and influence than his father had ever enjoyed. That is how aristocratic families survived in medieval England. You picked the right side, or you died. And if you happened to pick the wrong side, you switched sides fast enough and convincingly enough to survive anyway. The Howards became absolute experts at this survival strategy. By the early 1500s, under the reign of the infamous King Henry VIII, the Howards were among the most powerful, most influential noble families in the entire kingdom. Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, was one of Henry's most trusted and successful military commanders. He won major victories against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden in 1513, one of England's greatest military triumphs. He served on the King's Privy Council, advising on matters of state. He negotiated international treaties on behalf of the Crown. He arranged politically advantageous marriages for his children and grandchildren. And he became so deeply, so inextricably embedded in the Tudor court that his family's fate became completely inseparable from the fate of the monarchy itself. Thomas Howard was the uncle of two of Henry VIII's 6 wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Both of them were eventually executed by beheading. Anne Boleyn was arrested and executed in 1536 on charges of adultery, treason, and incest. Charges that were almost certainly fabricated to give Henry a way out of a marriage he no longer wanted. Catherine Howard was arrested and executed in 1542 on similar charges. The Howards were so close to the crown, so entangled in royal politics, that when the king turned violent and paranoid, as Henry VIII frequently did, especially in his later years, they bled, literally. Members of their family were arrested, imprisoned, and executed. But here is the absolutely critical point that defines the Howard family strategy. They did not disappear. Other families, when their members were publicly executed for treason, were completely destroyed. Their estates were permanently confiscated. Their titles were abolished. Their descendants were left with nothing. The Howards somehow survived. They stepped back from court politics. They stayed quiet. They kept their heads down. They waited patiently for the political winds to shift in their favor. And then, when the moment was right, they came back, stronger than before. This exact pattern repeats itself throughout Howard family history, over and over again. In the late 1500s, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the Howards were caught up in Catholic conspiracies and plots against the Protestant Queen. England was deeply divided along religious lines during this period. The Howards, like many old aristocratic families, had Catholic sympathies in a country that was becoming increasingly, sometimes violently Protestant. The fourth Duke of Norfolk was convicted of treason and executed in 1572 for his involvement in a plot to replace Elizabeth with her Catholic cousin, Mary Queen of Scots. The family estates were seized by the crown. Titles were stripped away. Family members were imprisoned in the Tower of London. For most families, for 99 out of 100 families, that would have been the absolute end. Total destruction with no hope of recovery. But not the Howards. They waited. They endured. They proved their loyalty to Elizabeth through years of quiet, patient service. They gradually rebuilt their connections at court. They married their children strategically. And slowly, painfully, over decades, they recovered almost everything they had lost. This pattern is critically important because it establishes something fundamental about this family that explains everything that comes later. They were not just wealthy. They were not just politically connected. They were survivors. They understood at a deep, instinctive, almost genetic level that power is not about winning every battle. Power is not about never making mistakes. Power is about outlasting your enemies. Power is about surviving long enough to fight another day. And that skill, that cold, ruthless, utterly pragmatic approach to survival is exactly what would save them 3 centuries later, when Castle Howard itself was on the very edge of destruction. By the late 1600s, after decades of civil war, religious upheaval, and political chaos, the senior line of the Howard family, the Dukes of Norfolk, had lost some of their former influence and power. Religious politics were a major part of the problem. The Howards were still Catholic, or at least Catholic-leaning, in a country that had become officially, legally Protestant. Several members of the family were imprisoned multiple times. Some were executed. The family estates were seized and returned and seized again. It was exhausting, inexpensive, and dangerous. But every single time, without exception, the Howards somehow managed to claw their way back to a position of at least moderate power and influence. And when Charles Howard, the third Earl of Carlisle, inherited his title in 1692, he decided that it was time for the family to make a statement that no one could possibly ignore or misinterpret. Not a statement made with words, not a statement made through political maneuvering or military conquest. A statement made in stone and marble and glass. A statement in the form of a building so grand, so overwhelming, so impossibly ambitious, that no one could ever doubt the power, wealth, and prestige of the Howard family name again. Charles Howard was not a man who thought small or acted cautiously. Everything about his personality and his life suggests a man of enormous ambition and boundless confidence. He had fought in European wars. He had served King William III with distinction in military and diplomatic roles. He had wealth accumulated over generations. He had tens of thousands of acres of productive land scattered across northern England. He had political connections that reached into the highest levels of government. But he did not have a house that matched his vision of what the Howard family should represent in the modern world. The family's existing estates were perfectly respectable by the standards of the time. They were comfortable. They were appropriate for a nobleman of his rank. But they were not spectacular. They were not awe-inspiring. They were not the kind of buildings that made people stop in their tracks and stare. And Charles Howard desperately wanted people to stare. He wanted to build something that would be remembered and talked about for centuries. He wanted to create a monument to his family that would stand as long as England itself existed. So in 1699, he made one of the boldest, most audacious architectural decisions in the entire history of English country houses. He commissioned the construction of the largest, most ambitious, most expensive private residence in the entire north of England. And then, in a move that shocked and bewildered almost everyone who heard about it, he hired a man who had never designed a single building in his entire life to create it. John Vanbrugh was a playwright and a soldier, not an architect. He had written successful comedies for the London stage, including The Relapse and The Provoked Wife. He had traveled extensively across Europe as a young man. He had been arrested in France on suspicion of being a spy and spent several years imprisoned in the Bastille. He had absolutely no formal training whatsoever in architecture, construction, engineering, or any related field. But he had something that formal training could not teach. He had vision, he had imagination, he had enormous ambition, and he had the supreme confidence to tell Charles Howard, one of the most powerful noblemen in England, that he could design a house unlike anything England, or indeed Europe, had ever seen before. Most aristocrats faced with a project of this scale and importance would have hired a safe, experienced, proven architect, someone with an established reputation, someone who would produce a competent, traditional design that followed established rules and conventions. Charles Howard did exactly the opposite. He gambled everything on genius, and that gamble paid off beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The design that Vanbrugh created for Castle Howard was genuinely radical, genuinely revolutionary. In an age when most English country houses were built in restrained, symmetrical, sober classical styles, inspired by ancient Roman and Greek temples, Vanbrugh created something theatrical, dramatic, almost operatic in its visual impact. The house was designed from the very beginning to be experienced like a stage set, like a piece of theater. You approached it down a long, perfectly straight avenue lined with carefully positioned trees. As you came closer, traveling down this avenue that seemed to stretch on forever, the central dome gradually came into view, rising majestically above the tree line like the dome of a cathedral. Then as you got closer still, the massive wings of the house appeared, spreading out symmetrically to the left and right, like the wings of an enormous bird. Then the statues came into view, then the fountains, then the temples and monuments and obelisks scattered strategically across the landscape in carefully chosen positions. Every single element of the design was placed in position to create maximum visual impact, maximum emotional effect. It was meant to overwhelm the senses of anyone who saw it. It was meant to make visitors feel small and insignificant, and it succeeded completely. Contemporary visitors to Castle Howard, writing in letters and diaries, described feeling genuinely awestruck, almost frightened by the scale and grandeur and overwhelming presence of the place, which was, of course, exactly the point. Construction began in 1700, and it would continue with various interruptions and delays for over 100 years. Charles Howard, the man who commissioned the building, would never see the house finished. He died in 1738 with major portions of the building still incomplete. Neither would his son see it finished, or his grandson. But that fact did not matter to them, did not discourage them, did not make them reconsider the project. This was not a house built for one generation's enjoyment. This was not a comfortable home meant to be lived in for a few decades and then replaced. This was a house built to last forever, to serve as a permanent monument to the Howard family name for as long as England existed as a nation. The central dome alone took decades to construct properly. It was modeled directly and deliberately after the famous dome of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, one of the most recognizable and celebrated buildings in the entire world. Inside, the Great Hall rose a staggering 70 feet from the marble floor all the way to the top of the painted dome. The walls were lined with marble, imported at enormous expense from quarries in Italy. The floors were made of massive stone slabs quarried from the estate itself and then cut and polished to a mirror finish. The staircases were so extraordinarily wide that, according to contemporary accounts, you could comfortably ride a horse up them without any difficulty whatsoever. Every single detail of the house, from the elaborate door handles to the ceiling frescoes painted by the finest Italian artists that money could hire, was carefully designed and crafted to communicate one single, unmistakable message to anyone who saw it. The Howards were not just nobility. They were not just wealthy landowners. They were an empire unto themselves. But building an empire, as Charles Howard and his descendants learned painfully, is expensive. Shockingly, ruinously, almost unbelievably expensive. The construction of Castle Howard cost the equivalent of well over £200 million in today's money, adjusted for inflation. And that staggering figure only covers the actual building work itself. The furniture, the art collection, the landscaping of the gardens and grounds, The teams of skilled craftsmen and laborers who had to be housed and fed, the architects and engineers who had to be consulted, the ongoing costs of maintaining an active construction site for over a century, all of that was extra. By the time the house was only halfway finished, by the 1730s, the Howard family was already deeply, seriously in debt. The kind of crushing, dangerous debt that had already destroyed other aristocratic families. The kind of debt that led to estates being sold off piece by piece, acre by acre, until nothing was left but a title and memories. But the Howards had something that most other families did not have, something that saved them over and over again. They had land, not just a few hundred acres around the house. They had thousands and thousands of acres of productive, income-generating land scattered across Yorkshire and neighboring counties. And in 18th century England, land was not just wealth. Land was not just social status. Land was power itself. The estate surrounding Castle Howard was not just decorative parkland designed to look pretty. It was a fully functioning, highly profitable economic engine. Tenant farmers rented land from the Howards and paid rent in both cash and agricultural produce. Timber was systematically harvested from the estate's extensive forests and sold to shipbuilders, construction companies, and furniture makers. Coal was mined from seams that ran beneath the estate's fields and shipped to rapidly growing industrial cities. The family owned entire villages outright. They collected taxes, tithes, and market fees. They controlled local courts. Castle Howard sat at the center of a vast, complex financial network that stretched across the north of England. As long as the land kept producing steady income, the family could survive. They could borrow money against future rents. They could sell timber or coal when they needed quick cash for urgent expenses. The house itself might be a constant financial drain, an endless source of costs and expenses, but the estate around it was a reliable money-making machine. And that economic foundation is what kept the family afloat through the 18th and 19th centuries, even as construction costs continued to mount and debts continued to pile up. Life inside Castle Howard during the 18th and 19th centuries was a study in the most extreme contrasts imaginable. Upstairs in the grand staterooms, formal reception halls, and luxurious private apartments, the Howard family lived in a level of comfort and luxury that most people today simply cannot comprehend. They dressed in silk imported from China, velvet from Italy, and furs from Russia. They ate elaborate meals that consisted of dozens of separate courses, each one prepared by teams of specialist cooks, working in kitchens that were literally the size of most ordinary people's entire homes. Their dinner plates were made of fine porcelain, specially commissioned from factories in China and shipped halfway around the world. Their wine came from the finest vineyards in France, Spain, and Portugal. Their furniture was handcrafted by the most skilled cabinet makers in London and Edinburgh. The walls of their rooms were covered with original paintings by acknowledged masters: Rubens, Holbein, Gainsborough, Reynolds, Van Dyck. The library held over 10,000 books, including rare manuscripts, first editions, and volumes that were worth small fortunes in their own right. The music room contained a massive pipe organ that had been built directly into the wall of the room, an instrument so large and complex that it required its own dedicated maintenance staff. Guests, when the family entertained, were received in ballrooms that could comfortably hold several hundred people. This was not just wealth. This was not just comfort. This was a lifestyle carefully designed and maintained to demonstrate, at every possible moment, that the Howards were fundamentally, essentially different from ordinary people. But downstairs in the servants' quarters, the working kitchens, the storage rooms, and the maze of basement corridors that most visitors never saw, the reality was completely, utterly different. Castle Howard employed over 150 full-time staff at its peak in the 19th century. Maids, footmen, cooks, scullery workers, grooms, stable hands, gardeners, gamekeepers, laundresses, housekeepers, butlers, and dozens of other specialized positions. These people worked brutal 16-hour days, 6 days a week, for wages that were barely enough to survive on. They lived in small, cold, poorly lit rooms in the basement or in cramped, uncomfortable cottages scattered around the estate grounds. They were strictly forbidden to speak unless directly spoken to by a member of the family. They were absolutely not allowed to be seen by the family or by important guests unless they were actively performing a specific task. They moved through a network of hidden corridors and back staircases that had been built into the very walls of the house. Invisible passages that allowed servants to move around the building without ever disturbing the carefully maintained illusion of effortless, magical luxury that the family wanted to project. This rigid system was not considered cruel or unfair at the time. It was not seen as exploitation. This was simply how the world worked, how society was structured, how God had ordained things to be. The aristocracy genuinely, sincerely believed that they were a fundamentally different kind of human being from ordinary people. They were bred for leadership. They were educated to rule. They were trained from birth to make decisions and wield power. Everyone else was bred by nature and by God's will to serve. It was a natural hierarchy, as fixed and unchangeable as the movement of the stars. And the system actually worked remarkably well for a very long time because almost everyone, from the highest duke to the lowest servant, genuinely believed in it. The servants were loyal, often fanatically loyal, because they had no other realistic options and because they had been raised from childhood to see service to a great family as honorable and meaningful. The family was secure because they controlled absolutely everything: the land, the law, the local economy, the church, even people's ability to vote. But that world, that entire social order, was already beginning to crack and fracture by the middle of the 19th century. And by the late 19th century, the cracks were becoming impossible to ignore or repair. The Industrial Revolution changed absolutely everything about English society. Factories, railways, banks, international shipping, and global trade created an entirely new class of enormously wealthy people who had never inherited a title, never owned an ancestral estate, never been part of the traditional aristocratic world, and had absolutely no interest in following its rules. These were self-made men, often from quite ordinary backgrounds, who had built vast fortunes in steel, coal, textiles, shipping, banking, and finance. They could buy country estates if they wanted to, simply to gain social respectability, but they did not need estates for power or political influence. The old aristocracy suddenly had serious competition for the first time in centuries. Even worse, they had traditional expenses that kept rising year after year, while their traditional sources of income either stayed flat or actively declined. Farming, which had been the foundation of aristocratic wealth for literally centuries, was becoming steadily less profitable as cheap grain began flooding into Britain from America, Canada, Australia, and Russia. Meanwhile, the cost of maintaining a massive house like Castle Howard kept increasing relentlessly. Roofs leaked and had to be repaired. Stonework crumbled and had to be replaced. Modern heating systems, indoor plumbing, electrical wiring, telephone lines, all of these new technologies that people increasingly expected required constant, expensive investment. By the late 1800s, many aristocratic families were quietly, discreetly selling off portions of their estates, piece by piece, just to generate enough cash to pay for basic repairs and maintenance. The Howards faced exactly the same pressures and problems as every other aristocratic family, but they had certain crucial advantages that other families lacked. They were not just rich, they were extraordinarily well-connected, both socially and politically. Strategic marriage alliances with wealthy industrial families brought in desperately needed fresh money and financial expertise. Political appointments and government positions brought in salaries, pensions, and opportunities. The family adapted to changing circumstances, slowly and carefully, making difficult decisions, compromising on things that previous generations would have considered unthinkable, but never ever losing control of the core estate. They reduced the number of servants employed. They closed off entire unused wings of the house to save on heating and maintenance. They rented out portions of their farmland to tenant farmers on favorable terms. They sold off paintings, furniture, silverware, and other valuables that were not considered absolutely essential to the family's identity and history. Every sale was painful. Every compromise felt like a betrayal to some members of the family. But it worked. By the time the 20th century arrived, bringing with it world wars and social revolutions that would destroy the old order forever, Castle Howard was still standing, still owned by the Howards, still intact, still functioning. And then on a cold, misty November morning in 1940, in the middle of the most destructive war in human history, everything nearly came to a catastrophic end. The fire started just after 9 o'clock in the morning on November 9, 1940, Britain's darkest hour. It began somewhere in one of the bedrooms in the southeast wing of the massive house. No one has ever definitively established exactly how it started. Some contemporary accounts suggest an electrical fault in aging workring that had never been properly updated. Other accounts blame a carelessly discarded cigarette. Still others point to an overheated chimney that had not been properly cleaned. What actually matters, what changed everything, is that within just a few minutes of starting, the fire had spread rapidly through the old wooden floors and up into the ancient timber roof structure. The staff who were present tried desperately, heroically, to fight it. They formed bucket chains. They dragged furniture and paintings out into the gardens. They tried frantically to contain the flames to just one wing of the building. But Castle Howard was simply, impossibly too big, and there were nowhere near enough people to fight a fire of this scale. The local fire brigade was immediately called, but they were stationed over 20 miles away in the nearest town, and the roads connecting Castle Howard to the outside world were narrow, winding country lanes never designed for emergency vehicles. By the time the fire brigade actually arrived, nearly 2 full hours after the fire had started, the entire southeast wing was completely engulfed in roaring flames. The fire burned completely out of control for 18 continuous hours. It destroyed over 20 major rooms, including some of the most important and historically significant spaces in the entire house. The central dome, the magnificent Great Hall, the state dining room where kings and prime ministers had dined, and the beautiful private chapel were all completely gutted by flames. The heat generated was so incredibly intense that the lead covering on the dome, which weighed several tons, actually melted and poured down the walls like water. Priceless paintings, ancient tapestries, irreplaceable furniture, rare books, family documents, and letters going back hundreds of years. Everything that could possibly burn was consumed by the flames. The structural damage was absolutely catastrophic. When the fire finally burned itself out late the following day, having consumed everything flammable, nearly a third of Castle Howard was nothing but a smoking ruined shell. The Howard family stood in the gardens, wrapped in blankets, staring at what was left of their ancestral home, knowing with horrible certainty that their world had just changed forever in ways they could barely comprehend. But here is the part of this story that most people do not know, the detail that makes this disaster even more tragic and complicated than it first appears. The fire was not purely accidental, or at least it was not simply a matter of bad luck or unfortunate circumstances. The fire was made far, far worse by the war. In 1940, Britain was locked in a desperate, existential fight for survival against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe was bombing British cities every night. Hundreds of thousands of children had been evacuated from London and other urban areas to the countryside for safety. The British government, acting under emergency wartime powers, had requisitioned Castle Howard, along with dozens of other large country houses across England, and converted it into an emergency boarding school for girls evacuated from cities that were being systematically destroyed by German bombs. The house was suddenly full of children, teachers, administrative staff, and others who had absolutely no experience whatsoever in managing a building of this size, complexity, and age. Fire safety was not a priority. Modern safety equipment did not exist. There were no sprinkler systems, no fire doors, no alarm systems, no proper training or procedures. When the fire started, there was immediate chaos and panic. The children were evacuated safely, thank God, but the house itself was simply left to burn because no one present had any idea what to do or how to fight a fire in a building this large. The Howard family was not even living in Castle Howard when the fire happened. They had been forced by the government to move out completely when their home was requisitioned. They had no control whatsoever over what was happening to their house, no say in how it was being used or maintained, and when they finally returned after the fire to survey the full extent of the damage, they were completely, utterly devastated. Not just emotionally, though the emotional and psychological toll was immense and lasting, but financially as well. The estimated cost to rebuild and restore the damaged portions of the house was well over £1 million, an absolutely astronomical, almost incomprehensible sum of money in 1940, when Britain itself was bankrupt from fighting the war. Insurance covered some portion of the cost, but nowhere near enough to actually rebuild. And this was not just about money and finances. This was about identity itself. Castle Howard was not just a building to the Howard family. It was not just a house where they happened to live. It was the physical embodiment of their entire history, their legacy, their place in the world, their connection to centuries of ancestors. Losing a major part of it felt like losing part of themselves, losing part of their very identity. Many aristocratic families facing similar disasters during and immediately after World War II simply gave up entirely. They handed their estates over to the National Trust or sold them to property developers and walked away forever. The Howards made a profoundly different choice. They decided to fight. They decided to rebuild no matter what it cost, no matter how long it took, no matter what sacrifices had to be made. The rebuilding of Castle Howard took decades of painstaking, exhausting, enormously expensive work. The central dome was not fully restored until 1962, over 22 years after the fire had destroyed it. The work proceeded slowly, carefully, one section at a time, because there was simply never enough money available to do everything at once. Every single decision had to be agonizingly carefully considered because resources were so limited. Should they restore the Great Hall first or repair the chapel? Should they replace the damaged roof or rebuild the collapsed stonework? Every choice meant sacrificing something else, delaying another equally important project. But despite all these obstacles and difficulties, the family absolutely refused to give up. They borrowed substantial amounts of money from banks. They sold more paintings and furniture and other valuables from the parts of the house that had survived the fire. They cut back on every possible household expense, living far more modestly than any previous generation of Howards had ever lived. And they made one absolutely critical decision that, at the time, felt to many family members like a terrible humiliation and betrayal of everything their ancestors had built, but which ultimately saved the entire estate. They opened Castle Howard to the paying public. In 1952, for the first time in the entire 250-year history of Castle Howard, the family began selling tickets to ordinary tourists. Regular people, members of the general public, could pay a few shillings, walk through the gates that had always been firmly closed, and actually tour portions of the house and gardens. For many members of the Howard family, especially older members who remembered the house before the war, this decision felt like an absolute betrayal of everything the family stood for. Their private home, the intimate place where they actually lived their daily lives, was now a public tourist attraction. Complete strangers walked through their halls, stared at their personal belongings, took photographs of their furniture, asked intrusive and sometimes insulting questions. The family had to create separate private apartments in parts of the house where tourists were not allowed to go, essentially hiding in their own home, living like refugees. It was humiliating. It was painful. It felt like defeat, but it brought in desperately, critically needed money. And money, hard cash, was literally the only thing that could possibly save Castle Howard from complete abandonment and ruin. By the early 1970s, the controversial decision to open to the public had clearly proven itself to be absolutely correct. Thousands of people visited Castle Howard every single year. They paid admission fees. They bought souvenirs, postcards, and guidebooks. They ate lunch in the newly opened tea rooms. They hired guides for detailed tours. The income was steady, reliable, and growing year by year. Castle Howard had become one of the most popular and successful stately homes in all of England. The family still lived there, still occupied private apartments, but they had learned to share the space with strangers. They had adapted, however reluctantly and painfully, to a completely new reality where their private life and their public role as custodians of a national treasure were permanently, inextricably intertwined. And then in 1981, something completely unexpected and extraordinary happened that changed the situation dramatically again. A television production company, Granada Television, approached the family about filming a major new drama series at Castle Howard. They were adapting Evelyn Waugh's famous novel, Brideshead Revisited, originally published in 1945. The novel tells the story of an aristocratic English Catholic family struggling with faith, memory, loss, and inevitable decline between the two world wars. It is widely considered one of the greatest English novels of the 20th century, a profound meditation on what was lost when the old aristocratic world finally ended. The television adaptation was one of the most ambitious and expensive series ever made for British television at that time. And the producers wanted to use Castle Howard as the primary filming location for the entire series. The house would essentially play the role of Brideshead Castle, the ancestral family home at the emotional center of the entire story. The Howard family agreed to the arrangement, partly because they desperately needed the substantial filming fees, and partly because they hoped the publicity might bring significantly more tourists to visit. The series finally aired in October 1981. It was an immediate, massive, overwhelming success, both critically and commercially. Reviewers called it one of the greatest television dramas ever produced anywhere in the world. It was broadcast in over 40 different countries. Millions of people who had never heard of Castle Howard, who had no idea it even existed, suddenly knew exactly what it looked like and wanted to visit. The unforgettable image of the house, with its distinctive dome and magnificent fountains and stunning gardens, became genuinely iconic, instantly recognizable around the world. Tourism to Castle Howard doubled almost overnight. Then it tripled. People came from Japan, America, Australia, from literally every corner of the world, just to see and photograph the place where Brideshead Revisited had been filmed. The series had transformed Castle Howard from a beautiful but relatively obscure country house into an international cultural landmark. And the Howard family, once again, against all odds, had survived. Today, in 2026, Castle Howard remains privately owned by the Howard family. Nicholas Howard, a direct descendant of Charles Howard, the third Earl of Carlisle, who originally commissioned the building over 3 centuries ago, lives there with his own family. He personally manages the complex estate, oversees the extensive tourism operation that now employs over 100 people, works closely with conservation experts and historic building specialists to maintain and preserve the historic fabric of the building, and carefully plans for an uncertain future. It is not remotely an easy job. The annual cost of simply maintaining a building the size of Castle Howard, just keeping it standing and preventing further deterioration, exceeds £2 million every single year. And that is just for absolutely basic, essential upkeep. Roofs still leak and require constant repair. Medieval stonework still crumbles and must be carefully replaced by skilled craftsmen using traditional techniques. Plumbing systems fail. Electrical systems need updating to modern safety standards. Paintings require professional conservation. The gardens need constant maintenance. There is always something that desperately needs attention and money. The house is now open to paying visitors almost every single day of the year, except for Christmas. Over 200,000 people visit Castle Howard annually. They tour the carefully restored staterooms. They walk through the stunning landscape gardens. They visit the well-stocked gift shop and the popular cafe. They attend weddings, corporate events, and concerts held on the grounds. Tourism now generates the overwhelming majority of the income that keeps the entire estate running and functioning. But managing this operation requires a constant, delicate balancing act. The family still lives in the house. They still use significant portions of it as their actual private home. They have to carefully manage the constant, unavoidable tension between historic preservation and public access, between maintaining family privacy and generating essential income, between faithfully honoring and respecting the past and adapting intelligently to an uncertain future. Castle Howard is definitely not frozen in time like a museum. It is not a dead monument to a vanished past. It is a living, working, functioning estate. Farmland is still actively rented to working tenant farmers. Timber is still systematically harvested and sold. Major events are regularly hosted. The house is frequently used for filming movies and television shows, which generates valuable income and publicity. Wedding receptions bring in substantial revenue. Corporate events and conferences use the facilities. The family has embraced modern business practices, modern technology, and modern marketing techniques, while simultaneously trying their absolute best to maintain the essential historical integrity and character of the place. It is exhausting work. It is phenomenally expensive. It is emotionally and psychologically stressful. But they continue to do it year after year because they believe deeply, genuinely, and passionately that Castle Howard is worth saving. Not just as a museum or a tourist attraction or a venue for weddings, but as a living, breathing connection to the past. A place where history is not just remembered or studied, but actively preserved and carefully passed on to future generations. This is not fundamentally a story about wealth, though wealth and money are certainly major parts of it. Plenty of families throughout English history were far wealthier than the Howards. This is not primarily a story about political power, though the Howards wielded enormous power for many centuries. Plenty of other families were more politically influential at various times. This is ultimately a story about survival, about making genuinely hard choices when easier choices would have meant losing absolutely everything, about adapting to completely new realities without surrendering your core identity and values, about believing that some things, some places, some legacies are worth fighting for no matter what the cost, no matter how painful the sacrifices required. The Howards could easily have sold Castle Howard dozens of times over the past century. The offers were certainly there. They could have handed it over to the National Trust and walked away free of all responsibility and financial burden. They could have simply let it slowly crumble and decay. They could have given up when the fire destroyed a third of the building. They could have given up when the debts became crushing. They could have given up when opening to the public felt like humiliation. But they did not. They fought, they adapted, they modernized. They opened their doors to complete strangers. They shared their most intimate private spaces with the world. And in doing so, through sheer determination and stubborn refusal to surrender, they saved it. 325 years after construction first began, Castle Howard still stands, still magnificent, still awe-inspiring. It has survived devastating wars, catastrophic fires, complete financial collapse, profound social upheaval, and the total transformation of the entire world around it. It has outlasted empires. It has outlived the very concept of aristocracy that originally created it. And through absolutely everything, through centuries of change and chaos, one family has never left, never abandoned it, never given up. And as long as Castle Howard still stands, as long as those distinctive domes still rise above the Yorkshire hills, their story is not finished. The survival of Castle Howard represents something far more complex and profound than simple stubbornness or family pride. It represents a fundamental shift in how aristocratic families understood their role in modern society. For centuries, the Howards and families like them believed they owned their estates absolutely, that these properties were theirs to use, enjoy, or dispose of as they saw fit. But by the mid-20th century, that attitude had changed dramatically. The current generation of Howards do not see themselves as owners in the traditional sense. They see themselves as custodians, as temporary guardians of something that belongs not just to their family, but to the nation, to history itself. Nicholas Howard has said in interviews that he does not truly own Castle Howard. He is simply looking after it for his children, who will look after it for their children, stretching forward into an unknowable future. This shift in perspective, from ownership to stewardship, is what makes long-term survival possible. But this shift came at an enormous cost, both financial and psychological. The Howard family of today lives in a way that would be completely unrecognizable to their ancestors. They do not have dozens of servants. They do not host elaborate balls for hundreds of guests. They do not live in isolated aristocratic luxury. Instead, they run what is essentially a complex small business. They manage staff schedules, worry about profit margins, deal with difficult customers, negotiate with contractors, apply for grants, and spend countless hours on administrative work that their great-great-grandparents would have considered beneath them. The romance of aristocratic life, if it ever truly existed, is completely gone. What remains is hard work, constant financial pressure, and the knowledge that one serious mistake, one bad season of tourism, one major unexpected repair bill could threaten everything. The house itself bears the scars of this long struggle. If you look carefully beyond the carefully maintained staterooms that tourists see, you can find evidence of the compromises that had to be made. Entire wings remain closed, their rooms empty and unheated, because there is simply no money to maintain them. Original furnishings have been sold and replaced with less valuable pieces. Some rooms that once held priceless paintings now display good quality reproductions, because the originals had to be sold decades ago to pay for roof repairs. The family's private apartments, where they actually live day to day, are comfortable but not luxurious. They are heated adequately but not extravagantly. They contain good furniture but not museum-quality antiques. The contrast between the public image of Castle Howard, this palace of unimaginable wealth and luxury, and the private reality of careful budgeting and constant financial juggling is stark and sobering. The question that haunts everyone who knows this story is simple. Was it worth it? Was preserving Castle Howard worth the enormous financial cost? The loss of privacy, the transformation of a private home into a public spectacle, the burden placed on generation after generation? The answer depends entirely on what you value. If you believe that historic buildings are just property, just assets to be bought and sold and disposed of when they become inconvenient, then no, it probably was not worth it. The Howards could have sold Castle Howard at any point over the past century, invested the money wisely, and lived very comfortably on the proceeds. They could have freed themselves from an enormous burden. But if you believe that some things transcend mere financial calculation, that there is genuine value in preserving physical connections to the past, that history matters not just as abstract knowledge, but as lived experience, then yes, it was worth every sacrifice. Castle Howard today serves multiple functions simultaneously. It is still, remarkably, a private family home. It is a major tourist attraction that brings hundreds of thousands of visitors to rural Yorkshire every year, providing employment and economic benefit to the entire region. It is a venue for weddings, events, and celebrations, creating memories for thousands of people who have no connection to the Howard family. It is a filming location that has appeared in dozens of movies and television shows, projecting images of English heritage around the world. It is an educational resource teaching people about architecture, art, history, and conservation. It is a living museum where historical objects are preserved and displayed in their original context rather than being scattered across different institutions. All of these functions are valuable. All of them justify, at least partially, the enormous effort required to keep the place functioning. But perhaps the most important function Castle Howard serves is symbolic. In an age of constant change, where most things are temporary and disposable, where old buildings are routinely demolished to make way for new development, where historical continuity is increasingly rare, Castle Howard stands as proof that some things can endure. It demonstrates that with enough determination, creativity, and willingness to adapt, it is possible to preserve connections to the past while still living fully in the present. This is not about nostalgia or about pretending that the old aristocratic world was better than what replaced it. It is about recognizing that there is genuine value in continuity, in maintaining threads that connect us to previous generations, in preserving beautiful and significant things simply because they are beautiful and significant. The story of Castle Howard also reveals uncomfortable truths about historic preservation in modern Britain, and indeed across the world. The reality is that preserving large historic buildings is extraordinarily expensive and difficult. Most countries, including Britain, do not provide nearly enough public funding for this work. The National Trust and English Heritage do magnificent work with the properties they manage, but they cannot possibly take on every historic building that needs help. This means that many historic properties survive only because private families like the Howards are willing to sacrifice their own comfort, privacy, and financial security to keep them standing. These families receive some tax benefits and can apply for grants, but the financial burden they carry is still enormous. They essentially subsidize the preservation of national heritage out of their own pockets. Society benefits enormously from their efforts, from the tourism they attract, from the employment they create, from the beauty and historical knowledge they preserve. But the costs fall disproportionately on the families themselves. This system is not sustainable in the long term, and it raises difficult questions about who should pay for preserving the past. Looking toward the future, the challenges facing Castle Howard are formidable and growing. Climate change is already having measurable effects on historic buildings across Britain. More frequent storms damage roofs and stonework. Increased rainfall causes problems with damp and drainage. Temperature fluctuations stress ancient building materials. These problems will only intensify in coming decades, requiring more frequent and expensive interventions. At the same time, the tourism industry that Castle Howard depends on is unpredictable and vulnerable to external shocks. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated this dramatically when tourist visits dropped to nearly zero for months, devastating the estate's income while maintenance costs continued relentlessly. Future pandemics, economic recessions, or other disruptions could have similar effects. There are also generational questions that cannot be avoided. Nicholas Howard's children will eventually inherit the responsibility for Castle Howard. Will they want to take it on? Will they be willing to make the same sacrifices their father and grandfather made? Will they see the value in preserving the estate, or will they see it as an unbearable burden? These are not abstract questions. Many historic estates have been lost in recent decades simply because younger generations decided they did not want to carry the burden any longer. The pressure is immense. The work is endless. The financial stress is constant. The loss of privacy is total. It takes a particular kind of personality, a particular kind of commitment, to willingly take on such a responsibility. There is no guarantee that every generation will produce someone willing and able to do it. The physical condition of the building also remains a constant concern despite decades of restoration work. Castle Howard is over 300 years old. Much of the original construction used techniques and materials that were never designed to last multiple centuries. Stone weathers and cracks, timber rots, lead roofing corrodes. The fire of 1940 left structural weaknesses that still cause problems decades later. Some sections of the building are essentially held together by ongoing conservation work, requiring constant monitoring and intervention. If that work stops, if funding runs out, deterioration would accelerate rapidly. Historic buildings do not stand forever on their own. They stand because people actively work to keep them standing. Yet despite all these challenges, there are reasons for cautious optimism. Castle Howard has survived for over 3 centuries through wars, fires, financial disasters, and social revolutions. The family has demonstrated repeatedly an extraordinary capacity to adapt and survive. They have proven willing to make difficult compromises, to modernize their thinking, to embrace new ideas while still maintaining core values. The current generation understands the business side of heritage management far better than their ancestors did. They use sophisticated marketing, maintain an active social media presence, constantly look for new revenue streams, and work to make Castle Howard relevant to contemporary audiences rather than just a relic of the past. The house also benefits from the fact that public interest in historic buildings and heritage tourism remains strong and appears to be growing. People increasingly value experiences over possessions, and visiting places like Castle Howard provides a powerful experience that connects them to history in immediate, tangible ways. The success of television shows and films set in historic houses has created a worldwide audience interested in British heritage. Castle Howard's association with Brideshead Revisited continues to draw visitors decades after the show first aired. This cultural capital is valuable and durable. There is also growing recognition, both within Britain and internationally, that private owners of historic properties need more support if these buildings are to survive. Some European countries provide substantially more public funding for historic preservation than Britain does. There are increasing calls for Britain to follow this example, to recognize that privately owned historic buildings provide enormous public benefit and deserve public investment. If such support materializes, it could significantly ease the financial pressure on estates like Castle Howard, making long-term survival more feasible. The story of the Howards and Castle Howard also provides lessons that extend far beyond heritage preservation. It is fundamentally a story about how to navigate change without losing identity. The Howards survived because they were willing to change almost everything about how they lived while preserving the one thing that mattered most, the estate itself. They gave up privacy, gave up traditional aristocratic lifestyle, gave up the illusion of unlimited wealth, gave up any pretense that they were fundamentally different from ordinary people. But they kept the house, they kept the land, they kept the connection to their ancestors and to history. This balance between change and continuity between adaptation and preservation is something that individuals, families, communities, and even nations struggle with constantly. The Howard family's 3-century-long struggle to maintain this balance offers valuable insights. Their story also demonstrates the power of long-term thinking in an age increasingly dominated by short-term concerns. The decision to build Castle Howard was a decision that would affect dozens of future generations, people who were not yet born, whose lives and circumstances could not be predicted. Charles Howard commissioned a building he knew he would never see completed. His descendants made decisions knowing their full effects would not be felt for decades. This kind of thinking, this willingness to plan and sacrifice for a future you will not personally experience, has become increasingly rare in modern culture. Yet it is exactly this kind of thinking that created most of the beautiful, significant, enduring things that enrich our world. The Howard family's determination to preserve their heritage, despite every rational reason to give up, also speaks to something fundamental about human nature. We are not purely rational economic actors who make decisions based only on cold financial calculations. We are emotional beings who care about meaning, legacy, beauty, history, and connection. We are willing to make sacrifices for things we believe matter, even when those sacrifices do not make financial sense. The Howards could have been much wealthier if they had sold Castle Howard. They could have lived more comfortably with less stress and anxiety, but they would have lost something that, to them, mattered more than money or comfort. They would have lost their connection to something larger than themselves, their place in a story that stretches across the centuries. Walking through Castle Howard today, knowing its history, understanding the struggles that kept it standing, fundamentally changes how you experience the place. It is no longer just an impressive building, a beautiful example of Baroque architecture, a lovely place to spend an afternoon. It becomes a testament to human determination and endurance. Every room you enter, every painting you see, every piece of furniture exists because someone fought to keep it there. The magnificent dome rising above you exists because, after it was destroyed by fire, the family spent over 2 decades painstakingly rebuilding it rather than giving up. The gardens you walk through exist because generation after generation, people maintained them even when it would have been easier and cheaper to let them return to wilderness. This knowledge adds layers of meaning to every detail. That crack in the stonework represents decades of weather and stress. That slightly faded painting survived because someone chose to keep it rather than sell it during a financial crisis. That repaired section of floor marks where fire damage was carefully restored. The house is not a pristine museum piece artificially preserved in perfect condition. It is a survivor, bearing the scars and marks of its long history, held together by ongoing work and determination. The visitors who come to Castle Howard today, the vast majority of them, know nothing of this deeper history. They see a beautiful building, take photographs, perhaps feel vaguely impressed by the scale and grandeur of the place, and then move on. But for those who take the time to learn the full story, to understand what it took to keep this place standing across 3 turbulent centuries, the experience becomes profound. You are not just looking at old architecture. You are witnessing the physical manifestation of human will, of the determination to preserve beauty and meaning in the face of overwhelming obstacles. The staff who work at Castle Howard, the guides who lead tours, the gardeners who maintain the grounds, the administrators who manage operations, many of them feel a deep personal connection to the place that goes far beyond just doing a job. They see themselves as part of the ongoing story, as contributors to a preservation effort that stretches back generations and will hopefully continue for generations to come. This sense of shared purpose, of being part of something larger and more enduring than yourself, is increasingly rare in modern work environments. It is part of what makes Castle Howard special. The relationship between the Howard family and the local community around Castle Howard has also evolved dramatically over the centuries. In earlier eras, the relationship was defined by clear hierarchy and dependence. The Howards were lords, employers, landlords. Local people were tenants, servants, workers. The relationship was not equal, but it was stable and understood by everyone. Today, that relationship is completely different. The estate is still a major local employer, but employees have rights, protections, and alternatives that would have been unimaginable a century ago. The family is no longer feared or automatically deferred to. They are respected for their stewardship of an important local landmark, but they are also scrutinized and held accountable in ways their ancestors never were. This changed relationship has required the family to develop new skills. They must be good employers, following employment law and treating staff fairly. They must be good neighbors, contributing to the local community beyond just providing jobs. They must be responsive to criticism and willing to listen to perspectives different from their own. The old aristocratic model of simply commanding and expecting obedience is completely gone. In its place is something more complex, but ultimately healthier. A relationship based on mutual benefit and respect, rather than hierarchy and power. Castle Howard's impact on the local economy is substantial and measurable. The estate directly employs over 100 people, from groundskeepers to managers to education staff. Indirectly, it supports many more jobs in nearby towns and villages through tourism. Visitors need places to stay, places to eat, shops to buy from. Local craftspeople and contractors find regular work maintaining the estate. The economic ripple effects extend throughout the region. If Castle Howard were to close, if the family finally gave up and sold the estate to developers, the local economic impact would be devastating. This gives the community a vested interest in the estate's survival that goes beyond heritage or history. It is also about jobs, livelihoods, and economic stability. This economic interdependence creates interesting dynamics. The local community generally supports the estate and wants it to succeed. But there can also be tensions. Some locals resent the traffic and congestion that tourist season brings. Others feel that entrance fees are too high, pricing out local people who want to visit their own heritage. There are debates about planning permission when the estate wants to develop new facilities. These are normal, healthy disagreements that arise in any community, but they reflect how Castle Howard is no longer separate from its surroundings, but deeply integrated into local life. The educational role that Castle Howard plays has also become increasingly important. School groups visit regularly to learn about history, architecture, art, and conservation. The estate runs educational programs teaching everything from historical domestic service to landscape design to business management of heritage properties. University students come to study conservation techniques, art history, and historic building management. This educational function helps justify public support for the estate and creates value that extends beyond simple tourism. For many visitors, especially international tourists, Castle Howard serves as their primary tangible connection to English history and culture. They may have read about English country houses, seen them in films and television shows, but visiting Castle Howard gives them direct physical experience. They can walk through rooms where historically important events occurred. They can see authentic furniture, paintings, and objects from previous centuries in their original context. They can stand in gardens designed 300 years ago and see how landscape architecture has evolved. This kind of embodied historical learning is powerful and memorable in ways that reading books or watching documentaries cannot match. The house also serves as an important research resource for scholars studying everything from architecture to social history to art history to conservation science. The estate's archives contain thousands of documents, letters, account books, inventories, architectural drawings that provide invaluable evidence about how aristocratic estates functioned, how buildings were constructed and maintained, how social relationships operated, how artistic taste evolved. These archives are carefully preserved and made available to serious researchers. This scholarly work helps us understand not just the Howard specifically, but the broader patterns of English history and culture. Castle Howard's survival also contributes to the diversity of Britain's heritage landscape. If every historic house became a national trust property, managed in similar ways with similar priorities, something valuable would be lost. Privately owned estates like Castle Howard, while they face greater challenges, also have greater freedom to experiment, to try new approaches, to develop unique identities. This diversity of ownership and management approaches strengthens the overall heritage sector by allowing different models to be tested and compared. As this documentary draws to a close, we return to the question posed at the beginning. Why does this story matter? Why should we care about one family's 3-century struggle to maintain one building, however impressive that building might be? The answer lies not in the specific details of the Howard family or Castle Howard itself, but in what their story represents about human nature, about values, about what we choose to preserve and why. We live in an age of unprecedented change, where technology, culture, politics, and society transform with dizzying speed. Old certainties dissolve. Traditional structures collapse. The pace of change accelerates constantly. In such an age, places like Castle Howard matter because they provide continuity, connection, and perspective. They remind us that not everything must be new, that there is value in preservation as well as innovation, that the past has important things to teach us if we take the time to listen. The Howard family story also reminds us that preservation requires sacrifice. Nothing endures without effort. Beautiful and important things do not maintain themselves automatically. They survive because people choose to preserve them, often at significant personal cost. The comfortable myth that important heritage simply takes care of itself is exactly that, a myth. The reality is hard work, difficult choices, and ongoing commitment. Their story demonstrates that adaptation and preservation are not opposites, but partners. The Howards preserved Castle Howard precisely because they were willing to change almost everything about how they lived and thought about the estate. Rigid adherence to tradition, refusing to adapt to new circumstances, would have led to loss. True preservation requires constant adaptation. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Castle Howard and the Howard family reminds us that some things transcend financial calculation. The decision to preserve Castle Howard has not been, by any conventional measure, a rational economic choice. The family would be wealthier if they had sold, but they chose meaning over money, legacy over comfort, continuity over convenience. This reminds us that we are not just economic actors, but human beings who care about things that cannot be reduced to pounds and pence. 325 years after an ambitious nobleman decided to build the largest, most impressive private residence in northern England, Castle Howard still stands. It stands not because it was easy or convenient or profitable to keep it standing. It stands because generation after generation of one family decided that it mattered enough to fight for. It stands because people chose preservation over profit, heritage over expedience, legacy over luxury. And as long as Castle Howard continues to stand, as long as that distinctive dome rises above the Yorkshire landscape, the story continues. The struggle continues. The preservation continues. The adaptation continues. The Howard family story is not finished. It will not be finished as long as someone cares enough to keep fighting. That is what makes this story worth telling. That is what makes it matter. Not because the Howards are special or unique, but because they demonstrate something universal about human determination, about our capacity to preserve what we value across time, despite obstacles that seem insurmountable. Castle Howard endures. Against all odds, against all rational expectations, it endures. And in its endurance, it tells us something profound about ourselves, about what we value, and about what we are willing to fight for.